Yo, everybody. Welcome to Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast about all things comics, brought to you by Sketch.com. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest is the cartoonist behind the recent graphic novel release from Random House Graphic, The Magic Fish. It's Trung Le Nguyen. Thanks for coming on, Trung.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
So normally, I mentioned this before, normally with first-time guests, we go over their origins before diving into their larger projects, but I think it's interesting because there is so much overlap between those two for you, because The Magic Fish there's a lot of you in it, right?
Yeah, there is. I kind of gave myself a little bit of permission to be as confessional as I wanted. I really didn't want to do an autobiography because I don't feel like I'm old enough to have lived enough life to, make an autobiography. That seems silly, but there are certainly a lot of elements within the book that hew pretty close to my own life experience, and I wanted to be a little bit more confessional because oftentimes debuts are that way anyway.
Yeah. I do think it's interesting. You mentioned like too young for autobiographies. I always do find it very strange when there's like a 22-year-old like movie star or something like that who comes out with an autobiography, and I'm like, what is this even going to be about? I don't even know.
Right? I'm not sure. Yeah, that always is confusing to me. I'm like, I'm gonna read about your adolescence, and then stop, and you have no advice for me.
Yeah. Well, we talked before for a feature I wrote on Sketched, and during that, one of the things we talked about was how, this is a big part of the Magic Fish too, but stories and going to the library were hugely important to you and your family in your youth after you all moved to America. Because from what I understand, you were born as a refugee in the Philippines, right?
Mm-hmm. That's right.
And so the importance of these experiences, both in terms of learning the language and culture, but also in connecting with you and your family even more. It seems like the library and stories were always crucial to your life as a family.
Yeah, it really was. I don't know so much that it is for my parents anymore. It was sort of a thing that they did to kind of help occupy my time. And it was a free thing that I expressed a lot of interest in. And so they didn't have a lot of resources. And so we went to the library a lot. And it wound up being really good for me.
Yeah, I mean, was that, for the family, that was like the stories were helping with the language. Was that something that really helped you as you were, first getting acclimated to America?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Both of my parents would read with me and my little brother. Whenever we went to the library, we would pick out a bunch of books and we would take them home. And it was a nice kind of family activity that we did after dinner. So it never felt like, it really was them kind of shoring up their English speaking skills. And I was, practicing my reading for school like any kid. But it really wound up being this kind of nice, tender thing that I can look back on fondly.
I think that's such an interesting thing about, growing up in a family like that. So like my mom would always take me and my brother to the library. I mean, there was two libraries we would mostly go to in Anchorage, Alaska. There was one that was weirdly in a mall. I don't even know if that's a common thing, but in Alaska, apparently that was a common thing. And then,
oh, wow.
And then there was this other one that was like the mothership. It was called Lusac Library. And I have so many memories growing up and going there and like getting books and my mom being like, okay, that one's good. But also my brother and I getting a whole bunch of Godzilla movies from like the 1960s and everything, and watching those and everything. And I just think there's so much magic in a library and like how they can fuse connections between people who should be connected by family, but sometimes story can enhance that, as you cover in The Magic Fish.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of my favorite things about wandering into a library is just the sheer amount of material that you can run into just by accident. Like I would not have, I don't think I would have engaged with as many different interests as a kid as I did if I hadn't been to the library and just wandered around a whole bunch. That was such an important part of like the library experience for me, was accidentally running into things that I wasn't looking for. That's how I discovered comics. I wandered away from the children's book section one day and got interested in the art history section. I remember asking a librarian, like, how do these books get made? Like, can you tell me a little bit more about that? And she was like, here's this entire art history section.
Wow. And
here's the children's books illustration history section. And there was this book on, I think, American illustrators, and it had a whole ton of like all of my favorite illustrators were in there from the books that I had, been previously reading. So Trina Shart-Hyman was in there, and the Dillons were in there. Tommy DePaola was in there. And right next to this, like, illustrated history of children's books were histories of comic books. And so I never, like, as a kid, I didn't read any superhero books kind of by myself. The floppies are difficult for libraries to, collect and hand out to kids. And there were some, but it was a very incomplete sort of history. And so I wound up reading about kind of the history of DC from its inception until now. And it blew my mind. And I didn't realize that storytelling could look like that, because all of the Vietnamese language books that I had were sort of illustrated books where my parents had to figure out, like, okay, what is propaganda and what is not?
Right.
And we need to explain this to you. And then the English speaking books were things that they didn't have a lot of context for. So I kind of got to run a little wild with that. And running into comic books was one of the best things that ever happened to me at a library.
Yeah. I mean, I know that one of the big things, I mean, you already mentioned some names, but one of the big influences for you are like classic magazine illustrators. And I think that that's one of the interesting things. I mean, I guess in some ways you could say that the internet has kind of appropriated that idea by saying, like, read if you like, or, varying other things like that try to path you to something else that might interest you. But that is one of the interesting things about the alchemy of libraries is, you talk to a librarian and you're like, I like this. And then they take you there. And then all of a sudden you discover all these other things you haven't heard of. Next thing you know, you discover all these magazine illustrators you never heard of. And that becomes like a foundational element for your art. I just think that's magical.
Yeah, it's really wonderful. Libraries were like the original, like, Wikipedia, like link spelunking, where you would like find an interest and then you would just keep looking for new keywords and you would find new interests. It's just like that, but like in real life. Like, imagine a room like that. That's great.
I was when I was a kid, one of the big things for me was my school had this like book club thing where it's like you would read 10 books and you would get on this list, and then 50 and then 100, and like the grand poobah was like 500 books. If you can read 500 books while you're in elementary school, you will get this massive trophy. And I can tell you what, I wanted that trophy. I read.
Did you end up getting it? Did you win that trophy?
I did, and I still have it to this day. It is a beast. It is like
oh, that's wonderful.
It is the biggest trophy I ever had, and it's funny because like you had to like go through and you had to write down every single one of them, and it was interesting. Like, I remember looking back on it when I was in high school or something, and it starts with pretty standard kid books and stuff like that, and then by the end I was like working into like Michael Crichton, all these different things, just stuff that like a fourth grader is not going to be normally reading. But it's just, I think that that's one of the interesting things about reading or going to the library or all these different things is it almost like accelerates your voraciousness as a reader. Also, I wanted that trophy, but it makes you learn more. Aggressively seems like the wrong word, but it also seems somewhat accurate. But it seems like that was probably important for you too, because it introduced you to all these worlds that ended up being very important for you.
Yeah, absolutely. It encouraged me to be indulgent and to be a little bit greedy. Like, I could go in and like read as much as I wanted. And that was such a beautiful prospect to me. And also just the fact that like anybody thought to gamify it for children is amazing.
I know, seriously. Congratulations, Huffman Elementary in Anchorage, Alaska. You guys totally ruled.
Good job, guys.
Well, so fairy tales are obviously a huge part of what you do. Like, your twisted romance story had a lot in there. Your, the magic fish is heavily built around that. What was the appeal of those as you were growing up, both as a reader and then like eventually as a creator? What fascinates you so much about fairy tales?
Well, I love fairy tales just because they exist in different iterations around the world. Like, there are always kind of alternate universe stories. I think that's something that was helpful in getting into comic books too, where, there are a lot of different iterations of the same universe. You see the same characters pop up here and there. And so it gave me this sense that stories can exist outside of what we consider to be a canon, and that looking for the original source is not always the right way to go about discovering more about a story. Fairy tales in particular, the way that they can exist in different places across the world, they kind of feel almost like people, where, they change their clothes and they change some of their priorities, even though the meat and bones are kind of the same, to kind of subsist wherever it is that they find themselves. And I love that about fairy tales, and that they're so accessible to children, but they're also so incredibly dark.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's funny to think about. God, what was they had like a Hansel and Gretel horror movie that came out that might have been like Blumhouse. And it's obviously a different breed of fairy tale. It is interesting how quickly those can go from being like really cheerful and aspirational to like, ooh, this is this is really intense. This is
Yeah.
yeah. I just find that interesting. And also like that's one thing I really loved about the Magic Fish was showing how these stories can maintain the same foundation in a lot of ways, but also translate across generations, translate across cultures, translate across all kinds of different things. But it's almost like these, you know, different cultures, like fairy tales can be a connective tissue because it's like it's a common language when in a situation where there isn't necessarily a literal common language.
Yeah, absolutely. And just kind of the fact that there are similarities between a lot of kind of regional fairy tales.
Right.
It helps that they're oral tradition too. So there's this strong sense of like, oh, like this is just going to be a collection of tropes that are thrown together. Like fairy tales are really fun for me because they exist in this plane of archetypes where none of the characters have like a really strongly fleshed out psychology, at least in kind of the older oral tradition ones. You get into literary fairy tales a little bit later. Like Hans Christian Andersen was working in the 1800s. He published The Little Mermaid in 1837. And so the way that he approaches telling stories is for children, for an audience that is literate, whereas the Grimm fairy tales are sort of collected and like edited and watered down from oral tradition sources. And so there are a lot of different ways that fairy tales can tell you about the people who are telling the story as opposed to anything the content actually has to say. And I think that's a great part of it. That's always fascinating to me, is how stories can tell you more about the teller than they do about anything in the content of the story.
Yeah. So clearly you know a lot about fairy tales, not just fairy tales, but the creators of the fairy tales. Because I was reading other interviews you had done about the Magic Fish, and you were talking about some of like Hans Christian Andersen's background and like the origin of like the Little Mermaid, for example. Has the story behind the art or the story behind the story always been a fascination to you? Or is that something that you kind of dove into as you were putting the Magic Fish together and you really wanted to know the roots of these things?
Yeah, that came to me slightly more recently. Hans Christian Andersen was someone that I was really fascinated with in high school. And so I loved all of the Hans Christian Andersen fairy tales. There was just something about all of the common themes of his stories. Like he writes a lot about longing. He writes a lot about kind of not feeling like you quite fit in wherever it is that you are.
Yeah.
And I didn't realize, I mean, if you read fairy tales and you're growing up and you're a kid, you just kind of, glom Hans Christian Andersen together with, the Brothers Grimm and with Perrault and with everybody else. And it's this big kind of amalgam of like vague fairy tale-ness. But no, he was a particular writer with a particular point of view. And I didn't figure that out until college, when I looked into The Little Mermaid specifically a little bit more. I took a harder look at the story and figured out that I needed to know a little bit more about the writer.
Yeah. I do think it's interesting, though, because you seem to know a lot about the people who made these fairy tales, but you said like when you were starting to read comics, or when you first discovered them, you weren't reading the comics themselves. You were reading like these histories of like DC and everything like that. And I don't know. I mean, I think it's interesting that either by intent or by accident, it's like you kind of like dabble in historian nature with this stuff. I don't know if that's overstating it, but I mean, it feels like it is.
No, totally. You know what? Actually, before I got into comics, I really wanted to work in some kind of like art historical context. I wanted to go into like working in a museum at some point, but but it did not work out that way.
Sure.
So I don't come from comics. I do come from a background that's a little bit more geared towards research and figuring out where things come from.
Yeah. Well, I did actually want to ask a little bit more about like what got you into comics, because you said that it wasn't really, superhero stuff because that wasn't something that the library really had. If I remember correctly, when we talked before, it sounded like manga was a big part of it. What were the comics that first got you into comics?
Oh gosh. I actually didn't start out with manga. I came to manga a little bit later, but when I was very little, the first comic books I read were probably Garfield. And I loved all of the collected volumes of Garfield. I actually was very recently tempted to drop a couple $100 on the entire Garfield collection.
Are you talking about the really horizontal ones that you would like?
Yeah.
Yeah, I had so many of those. I loved them.
Yes, yes, and I would check those out from the library. Like from ages 5 to 7, I would check those out every single week over and over and over. And then I would read the Sonic the Hedgehog comics. I had no idea what was going on, but I loved the colors and I loved the dynamism. And then when I got a little bit older, I started reading some of the Belgian comics. So I read Tintin a lot when I was growing up. And it wasn't until my parents took me back to Vietnam when I was really little. I think I must have been about yeah, I must have been about 7 or 8 because it was right after the second grade. And they had a lot of Vietnamese translated editions of manga that were being published at the time.
Hmm.
They were heavily edited, and they were printed on what was essentially like really flimsy newsprint. And I still have some, but I had read them to pieces and they're falling apart. But I only just recently figured out that what the comics were that I read in Vietnam were, and they were by Shinji Wada, and there were baseball comics by, oh my God, what is his name? He's really famous, but I can't remember at the moment. I'll get back to him later.
Sure.
But yeah, I started reading manga in Vietnamese first, and then I came over here, and Japanese comics hadn't quite made it to the United States yet. There was starting to be an interest in anime, and Sailor Moon was showing up on Cartoon Network, and there was some Toonami stuff happening when I was growing up, but I didn't have a lot of exposure to that on purpose until I think I was in middle school.
Mm.
And from then I started going in and reading a lot of, Sailor Moon, and I read a lot of Inuyasha, just tons and tons of different material.
I think it's interesting because I know that you're a fan of superhero comics. You it seems like you really appreciate something about everything in comics to a certain degree. And I am interested in do you feel like, being interested in Belgian comics, being interested in manga, being interested in et cetera, just everything. Do you think that reading a little bit of everything shifted how you think about comics and what they're capable of?
Yeah, absolutely. Like whenever I have a conversation with folks about comics, I always kind of have to give them the caveat that I don't necessarily come from comics. It's very strange because there's this tendency to want me to, recommend a comic book or like what are all of the things that I read growing up and who's my favorite superhero. And I have kind of pat answers for a lot of those things, but I'm sort of a kind of a jack of all trades
Yeah.
and master of none. And so I have like a pretty shallow understanding of a lot of superheroes, but my particular interests sort of lie elsewhere. And so I dive a little bit deeper into those things. But I confess to people that I come from children's books and that I, read fairy tales that were illustrated at the turn of the century. And so, and that kind of gets me out of conversations that, dive too deep into the lore of comic books. But like, I love superhero comics and I kind of love the history of them almost just as much. So there's a little bit of everything in the work that I do. It just doesn't show up on the page all of the time. I'm a big believer in sometimes a creator, likes to consume different things than they like to make.
Yeah.
And I'm certainly not someone like I love reading superhero comics and I like keeping up with like, oh my God, Ten of Swords has been so great.
Yeah.
And Hoxpox was really great when that was coming out. Like I love the X-Men comics that are coming out now and I'm trying to keep up with everything else, but there's, a lot going on in the world.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, it's one of those things where it's like I can't imagine actually, working in that mode, in that process where you're in an assembly line on a team and you have to work together in this very particular and rigid way. And I like to do everything like kind of, flying by the seat of my pants, making things up as I go, and I'm taking responsibility for every single deadline that I miss. I don't have to, make anybody else suffer for it.
You want to own it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. I do think it's interesting, though, because your love of fairy tales and your love of comics have like a lot of overlap because, I don't know, when I was growing up, there was like picture books. I'm trying to remember who did this one. There was this book called The 11th Hour that I was obsessed with. And there was all these picture books that I absolutely loved. And there was comics. And obviously I read a lot of, prose books as well. But I feel like, those Calvin and Hobbes and Garfield in that 11th Hour picture book and like comics and everything like that. I feel like that combination of words and art that are in all those different things make it, it made it a little bit easier for me to transition into reading book books. That sounds diminishing, but I don't mean it to. But do you think that makes, I don't know, like that overlap seems important. Like, do you think that makes comics a pretty powerful medium in the way that it kind of, I don't know, makes it easier for people to kind of dive into reading?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Like comics are so important to my journey through literacy in general, and I think it's really important to interrogate the way that we think about, comic books in relationship to picture books and the way that we think about pictures in books in general. There is a little bit of like, when you're growing up, you graduate from reading picture books into chapter books with no pictures in them whatsoever.
Right.
And so we kind of like hold on to that bias for the rest of our lives. But I insist now in my full adulthood, in my capacity to like think critically about these things, that pictures are its own language and pictures are an essential part of the text in a comic book. They're not separate. Like I think people describe comics as like words and pictures together. And I'm like, no, that is a little bit closer description to an illustrated children's book.
Right.
And so in my mind, an illustrated children's book is is an animal where there are pictures and there are illustrations, and each of them kind of supplement the other. And when you're very, very young, the text supplements the pictures. And so a child will look at a picture and be able to, determine what that picture is about. And then the text will sort of reify it so that they can know that they have read that picture correctly. And then as they get a little older, the balance sort of shifts. And so the text will say one thing, and then the pictures are there to support the text. And that's an illustration. It's something that supports this other text. And then with a comic book, it's completely different. Within a comic book, even though there's technically both pictures and text, the way that we like to think about text in a book, the pictures are the text. I like to use the word orthography a lot when I talk about comics. And so and it just means grammar. It just means like the grammatical rules of reading this text includes the pictures. And the fun thing about comics is that every artist has their own sort of language, their own set of grammatical rules that they will kind of follow in order to tell a consistent story. And the reader will be able to pick up on those things. And everyone who can read a comic book has access to a visual vocabulary that they're already in touch with. And so I keep insisting that comic books are just, they're just books. The text just looks different.
Yeah, totally. Well, and I think it's interesting too, because do you know who the cartoonist Lucy Nicely is?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I had Lucy
Yes,
on the
I love her work.
Yeah, I had Lucy on the podcast, and we talked about how Lucy had, recently done a graphic novel, or recently released. As you know, graphic novels have a tendency of taking a while to come out. Mm-hmm. But she was also doing picture books, and we talked about just not only how different that they are from a reading standpoint because of the difference between how words and images are integrated, but also the creation of it. It's just dramatically different experiences creating a picture book versus creating a comic. And but that's the thing though, is it's all about building literacy, and it's all about helping you understand how these things work, whether the text is a picture or the text is just a page of words.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I did want to ask, so we're about to get into Magic Fish, but I wanted to ask about like when you started getting into art too, because I know when we talked before, one of the things I found to be most interesting was the fact that you interned at the Minnesota Historical Society, but as you dreamt, as you wanted to do, as you originally wanted to do, but the government shutting down in Minnesota opened up a lot of time for you, which you started filling with making comics. Do you feel that in a weird way that the government shutting down set you on a path to being where you are now? Or do you think that would have happened anyways?
No, I think that definitely had a lot to do with it.
It's just so funny. Funny. I'm sure it wasn't funny at the time, but at the same time, it's like it's like a fateful moment in your life. It's fascinating.
Yeah, it was super harrowing at the time. Like comics was something that I had always taken an interest in, and I liked doing them it calmed me down. It made me feel comfortable in my storytelling, and it was like a thing that made sense to me. And so I'd always drawn comics ever since I was really, really little, but I never thought of it in terms of like this could be a real career.
Right.
Because I didn't know how those things were made, and I'm, first generation immigrant, and so I wanted to be responsible, and so I went to a liberal arts college and I studied history, and I wanted to make sense of the world in this way. And okay, so for your listeners who may not know what happened with me,
sure.
So in the summer of 2011, I was an intern at the Minnesota Historical Society. I was studying oil painting and art history in college, and I was really excited to get into learning more about kind of my local history and like being a part of this institution that did a lot of really wonderful work. And I was really interested in continuing to have a relationship with the Historical Society. And so was really pleased to land an internship there. And it was also a graduation requirement for me. And I was starting to do research on teachers. It was, gosh, what's her name? Harriet Bishop. I was looking up Harriet Bishop specifically. I looked at a lot of sewing samples. I looked at some of her writing. I looked at a lot of news clippings from the time that she was alive and looked into the temperance movement. And my role was to do a lot of research to shore up the materials that the actors who would embody the characters, like personify the historical figures for kids coming in on field trips. Like it was for the history players. Mm-hmm. And I thought it was really cute. And so I took that binder and I started adding materials to it and took some notes. And then I found out that the government shut down in Minnesota because there was a fiscal dispute between the Democratic Party. Well, in Minnesota, it's the DFL. So we have the Democratic Labor Party, and the legislature was Republican majority at the time. And so they could not settle on a budget, and then the government shut down for the summer. And because I was non-essential personnel, I lost my internship, and I was in a complete panic because I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to graduate. And suddenly this entire career path had closed off for me, and I didn't know what to do. And so I settled into the thing that made me feel safe and comfortable and made sense. And I started drawing comics and posting them to Tumblr.
What is it they say? They say every closed door is opening another one or something like that. I feel like you are a definite proof of that.
Oh, yes. Yeah. No, and it was such an accident. I always tell people that I graduated from college and then I tripped on my way out and I landed on my butt and found myself in comics.
Yeah. I mean, I do think it's interesting. It's like, I don't want to make it seem like you were an overnight success or something, but I just remember you showing up on Twitter one day. I was like, who the hell is this? What is this? And I was just amazed by your art. And I think the first thing I ever actually got from you was at Emerald City Comic Con. I bought a print you had made of Mercy from Overwatch, and I was just like, this is so fucking awesome. I love Mercy, particularly the witch skin, just thrown out there. But anyways, I don't know if you play Overwatch anymore, but
I do.
Yeah, I just started playing again. It's still very fun, even though it is occasionally a sociological experiment in game form.
Oh yes.
but let's talk about the Magic Fish. It's your new graphic novel, your debut even, your debut graphic novel. I'll give a spiel about what it's about. I'll do the solicit. Real life isn't a fairy tale, but Tien still enjoys reading his favorite stories with his parents from the books he borrows from the local library. It's hard enough trying to communicate with your parents as a kid, but for Tien, he doesn't even have the right words because his parents are still struggling with their English. Is there a Vietnamese word for what he's going through? Is there a way to tell him that he's gay? I am interested in how, the magic, obviously we've covered a lot of, your personal part in it, but how did the Magic Fish first start coming together as a story, but also as your first big project? Like what made this one that you wanted to tackle first?
Well, it was sort of a practical consideration because the Magic Fish actually started off as an art project where I kind of wanted to illustrate a whole bunch of different fairy tales that had a bunch of similar themes.
Oh.
And so I started drawing a version of Cinderella that was a German variant called Allerleirauh. I'm pronouncing that very badly, but it's sort of it's called Tattercoats, I think, there's an English variant. And it's like Cinderella, but it's quite a bit more traumatic. There's a small hero's journey that happens in it. And I was really fascinated by this particular iteration of it because it was far less domestic in terms of the things that she was required to do. Just as a character and her character arc, it was rooted in trauma that was less, I guess, small, I suppose. It was much more dramatic. There was this, there's an incident at the beginning of the fairy tale where there's this thread of a predatory incestuous relationship that her father represents. And then she has to escape from that. And then I had to clean that up in the Magic Fish a little bit because I did not feel like I had the ken to address that kind of particular trauma there.
Yeah.
And because, fairy tales are fairy tales, you can iterate on them however you want. And I felt pretty free to do that. But they started off as separate art projects. And then I realized that I could really I could make them gel together really well because they had a lot of common themes that resonated with me personally. And since, okay, so this is the very first comic script I have ever written, and I'm still not sure how to do it to this day. And I'm still kind of like figuring it out right now. But I'm learning that because I come from like kind of a more like the last long form thing that I wrote before this was an essay for my art history class. And so I went, I'm like, okay, so what is my thesis? What am I trying to say? And what are the common themes that I can thread through this thing that I'm interested in? And so approaching the magic fish kind of like an essay as opposed to a narrative
Hmm.
really helped me make it a little bit more cohesive. And so I discovered that I liked stories about transitions going from one place to another. Cinderella stories tend to be about, like the underdog kind of like getting into this place where there is safety and there's comfort and there's this, fulfillment of dreams and like escaping a bad domestic situation. And The Little Mermaid is about that quite like in a different sense. It's about longing to be someplace and to be with someone that you can't quite access and sacrificing things to get there. And then I realized that a lot of those stories have a lot of resonance with immigrants,
Yeah.
with experiences of people who, exist in whatever forms of diaspora, where there's this sense that you really need to be somewhere else, somewhere other than you are. There might be some political turmoil, there might be war, there might be whatever. You're looking for something new and something different, and you're looking for safety and comfort and stability, and you give up everything and you go somewhere else. And so the magic fish kind of like was my way of um, threading those things together.
Yeah. I read in an interview that that line about these stories being like immigrant stories, but specifically The Little Mermaid and how, her losing her tongue, like her language. I mean,
Hmm.
I think it's interesting because, I think in my mind, I always kind of looked back at the fairy tales in this very childlike way because when I first engaged with them, I was a child and I haven't really engaged with them since. But it's interesting when you can start looking at the depth in them and all these different things that could mean so many other things. I don't know. I mean, it's kind of like what you were saying with comics earlier, where it's like, the images, the text. It's like with these fairy tales, they can have so much more meaning if you just look at them from a slightly different perspective. And I think that makes them very fascinating.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Well, okay, so you approached it kind of like an essay. You approached it as if you knew that you wanted to tell these, three fairy tales. There's Tattercoats, there's another version of Cinderella, and then there's the Little Mermaid story. How did you decide that this, I'm going to say semi autobiographical, not autobiographical, but like, I don't know, I don't even know, let's say semi autobiographical framing would be the way that you wanted to connect those?
I think it was because I had watched The Princess Bride just before I pitched the book.
Oh, yeah, no, that makes sense.
Yeah, and so I was like, oh, you know what would be really great? Like if I did a story within a story kind of framework to contextualize why these stories are important. And so it was like, oh, okay, so this is a narrative vehicle that would really work for me in this instance.
Well, and I also think it gets back to what we were talking about earlier. It's the connective power of stories is tremendous. I don't know. I mean, it's something that I feel I'm going to say underrated, but I feel like I don't know if a thing like that can be properly rated. But at the same time, it's just, whether you're talking about me and my mom earlier, or you and your family, or Tien and his mom, or and his family and everything, these things are, you can form bonds through them. They're not just, stories where you read and you put down. They can be things that connect a family or, disparate people or, you with yourself or any number of
Hmm.
things. And I think that I don't know, when I was reading it, I was like, damn, this is just working. This makes sense. And I don't know. I think that's such a fascinating thing that it started, its roots were in the fairy tales and then you built out from there. I mean, it makes a lot of sense and it definitely works in the book.
Yeah, for sure. Like I think that just it has a lot to do with my belief that the story is more about the teller than the content. So it really like if someone tells you a story, they're kind of telling you a little bit about themselves. It's almost like lying, but you're upfront about it. And so you kind of like, okay, so this is the fantasy that I'm building. And so people kind of get a sense of a facet of who you are based on the story that you're telling. And I think that's a really kind of strange and interesting way that people connect with each other is through storytelling.
Well, yeah, and it is really interesting too because that is another fantastic element of Magic Fish is the fact that the person telling each of the stories changes from time to time. Like, you
Mhm.
know, when Tien's mom Hien goes to Vietnam, and God, is it her aunt that she's?
Yeah, it's her aunt.
It's her aunt, yeah, and the aunt is the one that's telling the story. And then, God, if apologies if I mix this up, but I think the story that the aunt is telling is actually finished by the mother, and the mother realizes in that moment that she can change the story in a way that works better for her family. And that's like the hammer moment. Like I'm thinking about that and I'm getting chills strong. It's like it's so good. And but I mean like it's like what you're saying though is just these stories can, whether you're talking about the magic fish or you're talking about the stories within it, they can twist or shift or change depending on what culture they're stemming from, but also who's telling them, because you're the one who decides what has the value in there. And I think that's, I don't know, that's like the magic of storytelling right there.
Yeah, and it's also the magic of comics, honestly, because I couldn't tell the story this way without doing it in a comic book format. I put a little bit about it in the author's note towards the end, where I kind of explain that each of the characters has their own visual vocabulary that's different than each other, and they're all based on things that they may have known growing up. And when I talk about like, okay, so if you tell a story, you're telling more about yourself than the content of the story. The same can be said about comic books too, because you're drawing from visual influences, like the things that stick in your memory that you can't quite place sometimes, because it's harder to just research pictures. There are no keywords that you can type into a search bar. You kind of have to really look and be intentional about figuring out the source of why you think things look the way that they look. And so the first story is told with Tien and his mother. And so it's kind of imagined from Tien's perspective, like what does a Western fairy tale look like if you're a 13-year-old boy who grew up largely in the Midwest? And so I looked up a lot of like, why do princess dresses look the way that, they do in the popular imagination in the United States? And so that was the visual basis for that story. And then the second story is told from the perspective of, an old woman who grew up in Vietnam before the war, and like what clothes did people wear? What did the buildings look like? And like, how does that inform the way that she thinks this fairy tale exists? And then the last one is based off of Hien's imagination. And so she has her own kind of take on the ways that the fairy tales exist within her mind and her memories. So it's all very much, it's about like this kind of radically empathetic practice of imagining what the world looks like through someone else's lens. And it's so much fun to do that, but I feel like it's also really difficult to do that as well. So I don't know that people engage with it quite as much as I would like them to, but I really hope the book encourages people to do that.
Yeah. Okay, so this is a random question. I just thought of it though, but the second story is where the titular magic fish shows up. Why did you decide the magic fish is the title?
Well, honestly, because all the stories have fish in them.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah, no, the first story also has a magic talking fish, and then so does the second story, and the last story is the Little Mermaid, and so they're all those things. And fish, I think, are so interesting just because they're like, I mean, not necessarily interesting. That they live in the water is not an interesting thing. They are fish, but but I like that. I wanted to pick. I wanted to pick something that was really simple and accessible, but also got across the notion of there is something about oceans, like there's something about water being a place that exists between land masses.
Yeah.
And sometimes you don't exist on one shore or another. You kind of live somewhere in the middle, and somewhere in the middle is the ocean. And so I wanted the magic fish to sort of embody that.
Yeah, well, and also inherently, like up here in Alaska, we have salmon that are constantly like moving to and from place to place, depending on what they're trying to do. And in a weird way, like not to go too deep into fish, but I mean, they're immigrants as well. It's like what is Tien's family if not people who cross the sea to find better opportunity just in the same way that they do. And
Yeah.
I don't know, that's very interesting. Well, I did, you have a very unique distinction in that you were the first book that Gina Gagliano acquired at Random House Graphic. And that is like, that's a feather in your cap right there, because Gina is like on the Mount Rushmore of like most amazing people in comics.
Yeah, that's wild to me. I admire her so much, and I still to this day cannot believe that that is the thing that happened to me.
I mean, it's incredible. I am interested in how landing at Random House Graphic changed, because I mean, Gina knows more than everyone else in comics combined about comics, and Whitney Leopard is amazing. So how did those two? You were talking about how you hadn't written basically anything long form since college. How did they help you sculpt the magic fish into the book it is?
Well, I think one of the things that I figured out about the process is that there's no one uniform process for putting together a long form comic book.
Sure.
I would ask friends who'd done it before, and I would ask creators that I admired, like, what is your process? What does your script look like? How do you do this? And every person had a slightly different answer, or a radically different answer, actually. None of the answers resembled each other literally at all.
Yeah.
Everything from the format of the script to whether or not you do the thumbnails alongside the script. And it's just everyone works very differently. And so I had to let go of the notion that I needed rules to follow. And I'm someone who really likes guidelines and I like direction. And so I often, I'm reaching out and grasping for something to which I can, hitch my process to. And that's not something that worked out at all. So I just gave them, I had what I had and I gave it to them. And it was, it wasn't an exercise in format. And I think because of the way that I grew up, there's a certain level of rigidity to how I think a thing should properly be presented. I'm like, what is the proper way to do this? What is the grammar of this? But they weren't interested in the form of the script or the thumbnails. They were interested in the story that I was telling. And so they guided me through the process of making sure that all of the ideas that I had kind of worked on the page. And as far as the story beats, they didn't give me a whole ton of feedback because they really wanted me to, have my vision be realized and not influence that too much, I think. And that was something that really surprised me. I didn't get a lot of critical feedback in terms of like whether or not this worked in a story. They were just like, yeah, this sounds actually nice. You can go ahead and do that. And I really appreciated that. But it made me so nervous at the beginning because I was like, oh no, does this mean that they don't have anything? Like, they don't have any feedback? Does that mean that there's too much wrong? Like, they don't know where to start with me?
Where do we start with this guy?
Yeah.
So much. No, I mean, I do think that's interesting though, because it seems like, not to speak for Gina and Whitney, but that they believed in the idea. It was more about helping you realize that vision.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, they were very, I don't know. I don't know how to describe their editorial style, but they kind of worked similarly where they would give me a little bit of feedback if I was unsure about something, and then they would kind of highlight some practical considerations like, will this or will this not fit on a page?
Right.
But the arc of the story was something that they kind of let me have full reign of throughout the entire process.
I read that one thing that they helped you with in specific was actually the colors, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah. I'm not someone who works comfortably in like a full palette of colors, and they wanted the book to be in color. And so I was like, what is a really nice way to incorporate color into this that won't give me a headache? And they were like, you're doing a story within a story. Help readers anchor themselves within the different universes inside of your book. And that was kind of where the different palettes came from. I don't remember which of them suggested it. It was either of them, but I remember it being like a light bulb moment where I was like, oh, like this is something that I could actually do that makes sense to me and would make sense to the reader and would serve the story. So they had a really lovely hand in making sure one of the most important aspects of the book, the readability of the book, was something they prioritized.
Well, it's actually a really smart solution when you get down to it, because it's like, it reminds me of, did you read Laura Dean Keeps Breaking Up With Me?
Oh yes, I love that book.
It's incredible. But I love what Rosemary Valero O'Connell did there with just like the pink. And it's funny because like I remember bringing it up to Rosemary and she was just like, everyone loves the pink, and I'm like, it works, it works. But I mean, sometimes a simple palette can be the right solution, and I think in this case it helps dramatically because you have you have different timelines, you have different stories being told, and so using color as a visual indicator as to like there's even one page where it's Helen Heen who is thinking about the past in the present, and they're both in the same panel, and you have pink and you have yellow next to each other, and that's a visual indicator that she's flashing back while in the present on the same panel. And like without that color solution, that would have been really tough to do, but it was a really elegant solution. I loved it.
Yeah, that was great. When I had originally drawn that page, I was like, oh, okay, so maybe if I put the present figure in the foreground and then just make sure that the flashback figure was in the background, that would be enough. And then I looked at it and I was like, no, that's definitely not enough. We need to do something else. But yeah, no, it was a very elegant solution.
Well, as far as the art in general, I do think it's funny. Like, it seems that people's favorite word for your art is detailed. You're definitely a rigorous artist, but at the same time, it feels like, I don't know, the fairy tales, like it feels so perfect with your art. Did you have any deliberation about like whether you're going to do different styles for like each, in terms of like the lines for each timeline, or was it really just like this is you and you just want to be you?
Oh yeah, no, I just wanted to draw how I wanted to draw. Yeah, it's actually kind of funny to me that people consider my work to be really detailed because really the only thing that, a lot of the detail goes into is the hair.
Yeah.
And that's also a practical consideration because I come from like children's books and not comics. I don't like, if you'll notice within the book, there are not a lot of action lines. They're not things that I tend to like to use. So I have to convey gravity and movement in different ways, and I have to figure out, a workaround visually that way. And that wound up being, okay, so the movement of fabric and the movement of hair is a thing that could really indicate to the reader that, there's a breeze, or, the character is moving this way, or a character is moving through the water like this. So it's a nice, it's a kind of subtle indicator of movement to the reader. And I know people can pick up on it, but I think that it works really well just compositionally because I'm juxtaposing huge areas of like just massive, massive amounts of lines right next to areas that are really actually quite spare. And I think people pick up on that.
Yeah. I have to say that the true star of the book is Alara's hair and tattercoats. I mean, it's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. Well, just a few more questions. I read this article that you were quoted in about how in many Asian languages, LGBTQ quite literally doesn't translate. And I think that, I mean, obviously that's a foundational element of the Magic Fish as Tien is trying to reveal who he is to his family. And he just is literally struggling to find the words. Mm-hmm. Why? I mean, it seems to me that, I mean, I'm hilariously trying to find the right words for this, but it just seems like a lot of it is about the importance of language, and more specifically, like finding the right words to identify who you are to those you know and love. Like, why is that such an interesting like territory to you as a storyteller?
I think it's less about my interest as a storyteller and more about kind of just my interest in language, kind of as a person,
Sure.
Because I oftentimes run up against a lot of folks who have a very prescriptivist notion of language. And I am also someone, like I said before, like I like rules and I like direction. I like being able to, have a template to work from. And I was like that with language as a kid too, because, English wasn't my first language. And so I was really insecure about being really specific and particular and precise about the way that I use the English language. And so I, sounded really stilted as a kid because I would read lots of books and then I would know all of these big words and the other kids wouldn't know what I was talking about because I didn't spend a lot of time just talking to other kids. I just read books.
Right.
And so as I grew up, I realized that language changes all of the time. Language is very organic. It shifts based on the needs of the people who are using them. And comics are the same way. You see a lot of people expressing a little bit of discomfort moving from like kind of a Western style of comics that kind of have a lot to do with that sort of like the Brandywine school of illustration. And then like reading manga and suddenly they're really confused about why everybody looks the way that they do. And it's also, it's kind of a strange thing because, if you're working in comics, you kind of understand that things have to work efficiently. And so you're sort of reading things like handwriting. And so everything is shorthand for something else and it's not depictive. And so thinking about language as a thing that is cobbled together by necessity because it's the communication part that's important. It's not the grammar part that's important.
Right.
That is the thing that I'm really interested in. And so I think within the Magic Fish, my point was more or less that language is something that is the thing that can, really pull us together. But if we don't have that, there are other ways to go about it. And so the characters kind of cobble together their own vocabulary and their own ways of expressing themselves to each other.
Yeah, like in the end, the mom using the story as the way to convey what she feels. Like I think that. I don't know. I find language to be really fascinating too. Like I always think that I use language like a sledgehammer effectively, but at the same time, I think a lot of times I don't know. There's like a literal version of language, but there's also a feeling version of language. And like those are kind of different. I don't know if different schools of thought is the right way to say, but I don't know. Long story short, I found that element to be very interesting because language it can be so much, and people don't even really think about how much the way that you say something or the way that you utilize it can change its meaning in very interesting and subtle ways. But well, actually, and related to that, I thought it was really interesting that Tien, the main character's name means advance or to move forward in Vietnamese, but the feminine version of the name actually means fairy, which I thought, I mean, I'm not saying that is the reason why you chose that, but I do think that's one of those things too, where it's like the different, God, oh my God, I'm totally spacing on the word, and like the accent on the name changes what it means, and for both of those actually work really well because you have fairy tale, but you also have Tien who's trying to move forward and trying to find solutions. I'm not saying that's why you chose the name, but I do think that's another thing that makes language interesting is just subtleties can change so much.
Yeah, that's definitely something I had to pay attention to. Like written Vietnamese is a tonal language, and so a lot of letters look exactly the same as another letter, except there's a different diacritical mark or something, and it changes the meaning of the word completely. And so paying attention to language, even even in my language of origin, is something that I have to be very intentional about all of the time.
Can I just say, I mean this completely sincerely. I love the fact that after I talk to you, I literally am going to Google words because diacritical is such a badass word, and I don't know what it means, but I love it.
It just means the accent marks, the accent symbols.
I love it. So, okay, well, I want to close with a couple things that were unrelated to your art in general, but I did, I find this to be a really fascinating thing. You're in Minnesota, right?
Yeah.
So I don't think people realize how surprisingly deep Minnesota is for comic creators. It's such an incredibly sprawling place for creators, and I don't think people realize it. There's like, Peter Gross, Jen Bartel, you're based out of there. There's the World Monster HQ studio. There's like a whole bunch of people that like, I don't think people are like, oh, that person is in Minnesota. It's like low key one of America's strongest comic areas, and I don't think they realize it. Is that, being in Minnesota and being surrounded by great artists and people who work in comics, is that something that has value for you, or is that I don't know. I just think that these communities popping up in unexpected places are always really fascinating.
Yeah, you know what? I don't know quite what my relationship to that is, because what I'm discovering is that oftentimes if you talk to another artist and you figure out that they're from Minnesota, you're both surprised. we all work in such isolation. I don't know that there's there seems to be there's a strong comics community in terms of the local comic shops do a really good job of connecting with their readers and connecting with each other. But I don't know that a lot of comic artists actually know each other super well.
Yeah.
I've known Jen Bartel for a really long time. I've always loved her work, but I think Like a lot of folks kind of transition in and out of Minnesota as well. But one of the things that I consider is, comic book artists, we never really wonder where they live.
That's true.
Like there's not like we work, I guess, in an industry that is entertainment adjacent, but there's no central hub for it. It's not like publishing on the East Coast or film and television on the West Coast. It's not like that at all. And we can work from anywhere and we can work largely on our own. So there's not really a reason for everyone to, kind of gather together in one place. But I don't know what it is about Minnesota. We just happen to have a lot of really great comic artists who live here.
Maybe it's because you guys are inside all the time, and so the cold weather doesn't bother you too much. I mean, I have a friend who's a comic artist up here in Alaska, and he's just like, it doesn't matter where I live. I scan my pages and I send them in no matter what. And I'm like, there you go. That makes sense. I do. It's just always interesting to me how things like that pop up, though, because people think of Portland and New York and Los Angeles as these like central hubs, but I know so many people in like Dublin, Ireland who are comic creators, and people in Minnesota and et cetera, et cetera. It's just, I think that's one of the cool things about comics too. I mean, I guess it's the case for a lot of things, but comic creators can be nomadic. Comic creators can go wherever, they can exist wherever, and they can still get their jobs done. And I think that's fantastic. I mean, one of my favorite people in comics is Matt Wilson, colorist, and he literally is often doing his work while traveling around by van. And that you don't think about that while you're reading Thor, but it's a thing. And I think that's awesome.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think one of the things that we fail to appreciate about comics and comic creators is that it is such a specific and widely varied tool set. It's so difficult to effectively tell a story in comic book form. And so every single facet of a comic book, like from the scripting, like you have to be a good writer, you have to be a good editor, you have to be a really good communicator on a team, you have to be a teacher, you have to be effective at communicating the nuances of images with spoken language so that your writer can tell your artist what to do and your inker can tell your penciler what they're thinking. And like it's such a strong and very, very complex suite of skills that we take totally for granted. And what ends up happening is that comic artists do exist everywhere because their skills can cross over really easily into other industries. Like I know a lot of comic artists who dovetail into animation totally seamlessly. And some comic writers can go on to write television and film and go on to do journalism. Like there are so many different ways that a person's skills within comics can apply to other industries, and we sort of take for granted that they come together in a really powerful way. So comics are great and people should pay more attention to them because they're really hard.
I wonder if that versatility is part of the reason why there's so many different approaches to it, because every person has their own skill set and their own way of thinking. And so it's like, maybe one person only thinks in 9-panel grids. Maybe one person only thinks in double page spreads. Maybe one person scripts with thumbnails on the script and they don't, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it's interesting how malleable of an art form it is from creation to finality.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like playing an RPG video game and like putting putting your skill points into different skill trees. Everybody ends up, prioritizing different things, but they're all effective at what they do.
I love that. That is amazing. That is so fantastic. Well, okay, I mentioned this before we started recording. One thing that is interesting about your career is I feel like a lot of people know you as Trungles. That was your identity on Twitter. That is it's just what you worked under for a while. And now you're going by your name. First off, I wanted you to share the origin of your name, Trungles. And then also I was curious if, why it was necessary to move on from that name in terms of like this first big book.
Sure. Okay. So when I was in high school, I gave a speech in an English class at some point, and I did so poorly and I was so nervous. And I was like, okay, this is something that I need to fix because I am such a bad public speaker. I need to do something about it. And so I joined the speech team, and I eventually wound up doing really well. And at some speech tournament, I must have been like 15 or 16. I won something, and the person who announced my name smushed my first name, Trung, with my middle name, Lee, with just the one E together, and called me Trungle in front of this audience full of teenagers and teachers. And I did not hate it. I got up on the stage and I was like, this is who I am now. Yeah, and so that sort of stuck. I just added the S at the end because I don't want to be, just the one Trungle. I want to be all the Trungles. Plant my flag right there. And it was the handle that I worked under for tons and tons of years, and it's something that I think I'll always keep. But I think, it was important for my debut story, something so personal, to be under my real name, to kind of, not mask the fact that I'm a Vietnamese American person with a name that people might find difficult to pronounce. I'm not at all ashamed of that.
Yeah, no, I mean, that totally makes sense. I love that you embrace that. I mean, when I was growing up, so here's my full name is David Leroy Harper II.
Oh,
Yeah, so it is like when I was growing up, I was terribly embarrassed of Leroy. I don't even know why. I mean, I guess it's just because it's kind of an old timey name, and in my head, I was just like, why is that my name? And it's my dad's middle name, and that's the reason why I'm Leroy. And then I eventually realized that Leroy means the king. And also on top of that, I'm the second. So I'm like the second king. I was like, eventually I realized to embrace that, because I don't know. I just think it's really interesting, our relationship with things like that, and how, like, in that moment you were like, this is pretty cool. I like Trungle. Yeah. And being all of the Trungles is even better. I mean, like, that's fantastic. Well, last question. Your hens. I don't even really have a question about your hens. Your hens, whenever you would post videos of you feeding them or like picking them up or whatever, those were like low key, like one of my like pandemic like moments of zen whenever you'd post something like that. How did you get into having hens? And why are they so damn cute?
I was really against the idea of them for a long time. So they were actually my spouse's idea. They decided that we wanted to raise hens. And Minneapolis allows you to raise a certain amount of hens. We can have roosters, but we have to have we have to fill out different paperwork. It costs more. We wanted hens because we didn't want to wake up at 4 or 5 in the morning every day to a rooster crowing.
Solid choice.
So I'm not an animal person, really. I've never considered myself to be one. My whole thing is, if something has its own personality and its own intestinal tract, like, that's not something that I want to take care of. That's not for me. But, my partner took me out to, they ordered chickens. We got them as chicks. We picked them up from, they would arrive from the hatchery to this, central location where the chicken supply is. And we would go and pick them up. And they were in this little box, and they started kind of playing with each other on the ride home. And I decided that I was going to take care of them for the rest of their lives. And I was going to be very sentimental about it, because they were just very charming. And, raising them from chicks to being full grown hens has been such a lovely thing to do during, these uncertain times.
Yeah.
And it was such a great experience. I wound up doing things that I never imagined that I would do. Like, one of the hens, for some reason, was laying bloody eggs. And so at one point I drove out to a Target to get hemorrhoid cream for her and applied it to her for 3 days. So it was, just a lot of like very strange kind of funny things in terms of hen keeping. I'm technically a chicken tender now, I suppose.
Oh my God. Is that what it's actually called? Chicken tender?
No, it's not. I think it's just a bad pun that someone repeated, and now it's stuck in my head. I'm a chicken tender, one who tends chickens.
That is hilarious. I love it. I do think it's funny. I never wanted to have pets either. And then my wife and I decided to get a cat. And then within the first day, I was like, I immediately understood those stories about like mothers who would lift vehicles off their child.
Yeah.
I was just like, I think I at one point said, there's multiple things I've said, but one is I would take a bullet for my cat. And the other thing is that at some point in my life, I would like to become the Jane Goodall of cats. And so
that's great.
I do think it's funny how those things shift so quickly. And sometimes it's not even something like overly like amazing. It's just like seeing them engage in a box with each other and playing and stuff. It's like something in your brain unlocks, and then all of a sudden you're like, I would give my life for these hens.
Yeah, there's just something about being a human being and having compassion, where you have this theoretical idea of what you want in your head, and then you encounter it in real life and you realize that your priorities are different, and that's, a really wonderful thing to sort of just go with.
Absolutely. Well, you've had a lot of wonderful things to go with, including the magic fish, and I was really happy to talk about it. But Trung, that is all I have for you. Thank you so much for coming on to talk about all of that, and thanks for taking the time.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. This was a great chat. I had a lot of fun.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with cartoonist Trung Le Nguyen. You can find Trung on Twitter at Trungles, on their website at trungles.com, and in their recent debut graphic novel, The Magic Fish. If you're a fan of Off Panel, make sure to check it out on Patreon. If you back the show on there, you not only support it, but you get early access to each week's podcast, access to weekly content, and more. Also, don't forget to subscribe to Off Panel on iTunes or Spotify and give the show a rating and review while you're at it. You can find Off Panel and Sketched on social media by liking it on Facebook at /Sketched. That's SKTCHD. Follow it on Twitter and Instagram at SketchComic or following me at @SlicedFriedGold. Off Panel is once again brought to you by Sketch.com. Check out Sketched, my subscription comic site for long-form articles, interviews, and more, and consider subscribing for access to all of the site's content and its members-only forum. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Patrick Brower, Declan Shalby, Dan Garino, Josh Williamson, Adam Freeman, Ben Wild, Brian Klein Q, SB, Antonio Offen, Nick Bennett, Daniel Whitfield, Scotty Young, Susanna Polo, Jeff Weira, Reed Hinkley Barnes, Mario Tiambang, AbductedTheComic.com, Andrew Carita, Matt Mahoney, Charlie Chu, Stephen Hall, Pensacola Pop Comics, Kim Eslin, Philip Myra, Christian Sheldon, Kenny Porter, Chris Pachalo, Torin Grunbeck, Fuzz Bubbles, Christopher Todd, Transmitter Down, Waltz Comics and Books, Carl Mizell, Danny Ollie, Paul Salade, Sakil Wilson, Alex Dimitriopoulos, Terry Dodson, Liana Kingas, Keegan Ray, Wesley Gift, Sean Kirkham, Harry Small, Alistair Ross, Julio Amta, Brett A. Schmidt, Jason Goodmanson, Paul Reinwan, Vita Ayala, Tara Ferguson, Dave Slusher, WMQ Comics, Akil Kokachi, Phil White, Sean Pennell, Ken Heidelman, Philip Seavey, Al Urine, Ryan Alcock, Nick Michelin, David Kelly, Rob Wilson IV, Nick Plato, Owen McCready, Brendan Fletcher, Gary Maloney, Jonathan Nilsson, Matthew Groom, Jason Assey, Adam Bogart, Xavier Files, Matthew Taylor, Nick Patera, Jacob Sorelli, Ford Gilmore, David Brody, Nick Hall, Bjorn Basin, John Hendricks, Steve Anderson, Ian Maxfield, Cliff Chang, Benjamin Shipper, Colin McMahon, Chris Palmer, Scott McGovern, Nathan Fairbairn, Kat McKenzie, Adam Highfield, Fiona Staples, Chris Halloran, Mark Abnett, Mike Murphy, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim Demonacos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comics and Art San Francisco. You guys are all the best. A quick thanks to Upright T-Rex Music, who wrote and performed Off Panel's theme song just for the show. Check out their music on Spotify because it's completely delightful. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.